I've spent decades inside the American military machine. I've studied every major air power doctrine the United States and its allies have built since the Second World War. I've watched the Pentagon write the manuals, fund the platforms, and sell the narrative that Western air superiority was a permanent condition of the modern strategic environment, a condition so deeply embedded in the operational assumptions of every American ally that questioning it felt like questioning gravity itself. What happened to Israel's Air Force in the 8 minutes between the first Khorramshahr 4 leaving its launch cell and the last one impacting at Nevatim Air Base is not an event I find satisfying to analyze. It is an event I find necessary to analyze because the institutions responsible for preventing it will not tell you the truth about what happened, why it happened, and what it means for every air power doctrine built on the same foundational assumptions that just got obliterated, along with 90% of Israel's operational combat aircraft. 350 Khorramshahr, 4 ballistic missiles, 8 minutes Nevatim Air Base, the crown jewel of Israeli air power, the home of the F-35 Ayadir squadrons, the installation around which Israel's entire offensive air doctrine has been organized for the past decade, reduced from the most sophisticated air base in the Middle East to a field of burning wreckage that satellite imagery is already transmitting to every defense ministry on the planet. 90% of Israel's operational air power gone, not damaged, not degraded, gone in a time frame so compressed that the pilots who survived did so because they happened to be airborne, not because any defensive system, any warning protocol, or any doctrine designed to protect the force from exactly this scenario performed adequately. What you are about to hear is not what the IDF spokesman will tell you. It is not what the State Department will acknowledge. It is not what the think tanks whose funding depends on maintaining the illusion of Western air power invincibility will publish. It is what actually happened, analyzed by someone who has spent a career inside the system that just failed, who understands exactly why it failed, and who has been warning for years that this failure was not a possibility but an inevitability. The age of assumed Israeli air dominance ended in 8 minutes over the Negev desert, and the weapon that ended it was not built in some Western laboratory with unlimited resources. It was built by a nation under sanctions, under siege, and under the kind of sustained external pressure that, rather than breaking Iranian strategic will, forged it into something the Pentagon's threat assessments consistently refused to take seriously enough. Tonight, this channel delivers the complete, unfiltered analysis of what those 8 minutes actually mean. Before this analysis goes deeper, 4 questions are going to be answered in the next 40 minutes that the emergency briefings in Tel Aviv and Washington are specifically designed to prevent from reaching full public clarity. First, how did 350 Khorramshahr 4 ballistic missiles reach Nevatim Air Base simultaneously in 8 minutes? Bypassing the most sophisticated layered air defense architecture in the Middle East outside of American home territory? And what does that answer reveal about the foundational failure of every doctrine and every procurement decision that was supposed to prevent exactly this outcome? Second, the Khorramshahr 4 is a weapon I have been watching develop for years with the particular attention of someone who understands what it was designed to defeat. What makes it categorically different from everything that preceded it, and why was the combined arrow, David's sling, and Iron Dome architecture that Israel has invested billions in building unable to stop 350 of them in a compressed 8-minute window? Third, Israel's entire rapid, decisive warfare doctrine depends on air power as its foundational instrument. When 90% of that instrument is destroyed in 8 minutes, what does the IDF actually have left? And how does a military establishment built around the assumption of air dominance function in a theater where that dominance has been eliminated? And fourth, what does Washington actually do now? I've sat in the rooms where these decisions get made. I know the options being discussed. I know which ones are real and which ones are theater. And the gap between what the American political system will say and what the American military establishment privately understands about the strategic situation Israel now occupies is wider tonight than at any point in the history of the relationship. If you are watching this because you understand that the institutions responsible for this failure are not the institutions you should trust to explain it, hit like, subscribe, and drop your perspective in the comments. The conversation that needs to happen about what 8 minutes over Nevatim means is not happening anywhere in mainstream coverage. It needs to happen here. When I look at the engagement geometry of what happened at Nevatim Air Base in those 8 minutes, what I see is not bad luck. It is not an intelligence failure in the narrow sense of that term. It is the inevitable operational output of a targeting doctrine that Iran has been refining for years against a specific target set whose coordinates, defensive coverage, architecture, and force protection vulnerabilities have been systematically mapped with a patience and precision that the Israeli intelligence community either could not track or chose not to adequately weight in its threat assessments. Nevatim Air Base in the Negev Desert is not simply an airfield. It is the most consequential single military installation in the Israeli order of battle, the home of the 140th Golden Eagle Squadron and the 116th Flying Wing. The primary operational basis for Israel's F-35I Adir fleet, the installation around which Israel's entire fifth-generation air-power doctrine has been constructed. Destroy Nevatim operationally, and you have not damaged Israeli air power. You have removed its most critical offensive instrument from the strategic equation in a single action. Iran understood this. The targeting package for last night's engagement was not designed to hurt Israel. It was designed to blind it. 350 Khorramshahr, 4 missiles were not assigned to Nevatim arbitrarily. The number reflects a targeting calculation of cold precision and assessment of the combined intercept capacity of every Arrow 3, Arrow 2, David Sling, and Patriot battery within engagement range of the base, the reload cycles of those systems, the radar coverage geometry that shapes which trajectories present the most challenging intercept solutions, and the residual missile volume required to ensure the destruction of the physical infrastructure across the base's critical nodes, even after absorbing the maximum realistic defensive response. In my assessment, this targeting calculation was not produced in a single planning cycle. It was the product of years of Iranian intelligence collection satellite imagery analysis of Nevatim's construction and expansion, electronic intelligence collection against the radar signatures of the defensive systems protecting it, open source analysis of Israeli procurement records that identified the specific interceptor inventories maintained at each defensive battery, and the operational experience accumulated from watching Israel's defensive systems perform in every previous engagement. The engagement unfolded in a compression of time that the defending systems were structurally unable to manage. The Khorramshahr 4's flight profile from launch positions in western Iran to Nevatim covers approximately 1,000 kilometers of flight time, depending on trajectory, of approximately 8 to 12 minutes from launch detection to impact. That window is not generous for a defensive system that must detect, track, classify, prioritize, and execute intercept solutions against hundreds of simultaneous inbound ballistic trajectories while managing the engagement sequencing across multiple battery types with different intercept altitude bands and different engagement geometries. Arrow 3 was designed for exoatmospheric intercept of long-range ballistic threats, the highest tier of the architecture, engaging the longest range and highest altitude trajectories. Arrow 2 handles the mid-tier threats at lower altitudes. David Sling covers the medium-range ballistic and cruise missile threats between Arrow's lower limit and Iron Dome's upper engagement altitude. In a rational sequential engagement scenario, these systems work in coordinated layers, each tier engaging what its parameters are optimized for, passing residual threats down to the next layer. 350 simultaneous inbounds compressed into a single 8-minute window breaks the coordination assumption. When Arrow 3 is executing simultaneous engagement solutions against the highest trajectory threats, when Arrow 2 is simultaneously processing its own queue of mid-tier inbounds, when David Sling is simultaneously tracking and engaging the trajectories optimized for its engagement band, the total number of intercept solutions being executed simultaneously across the integrated architecture approaches, and then exceeds the combined processing capacity of the system. Interceptor magazines deplete faster than reload cycles can service them. Engagement sequencing algorithms must make triage decisions about which threats to prioritize and which to allow through the threats that are allowed through reach their targets. From where I stand, the most significant failure at Nevatim was not a failure of the defensive technology in isolation. The Arrow system, David Sling, and the Patriot batteries are capable systems that perform their design functions. The failure was a failure of doctrine, the assumption that a layered architecture of finite interceptor capacity can indefinitely protect a fixed, known, high-value target against an adversary that has precisely mapped that architecture, calculated its throughput limits, and sized its salvo to exceed those limits by a margin that ensures sufficient residual penetration to achieve the operational objective. I've watched the American military make this same doctrinal assumption for 30 years. We built magnificent defensive systems. We wrote the procurement documents. We ran the war games. And in every war game, the salvo size the adversary was allowed to fire was calibrated to the size that our systems were designed to defeat. Nobody seriously modeled what happens when the adversary fires a salvo 3 times larger than the systems were designed to handle simultaneously. Iran modeled it. Iran built for it. And last night, Iran executed it. 90% of Israel's operational air power destroyed in 8 minutes. The F-35 Iadirs that survived did so because they happened to be airborne on other missions when the missiles arrived. The aircraft on the ground, the maintained aircraft, the fueled and armed aircraft ready for immediate tasking, the aircraft that constitute the ready force at the core of Israel's rapid response capability were on the ramps when the Khorramshahr 4 warheads arrived. They are not on the ramps anymore. The physical destruction at Nevatim was comprehensive in a way that will take Israeli defense analysts years to fully document. Hardened aircraft shelters, the reinforced concrete structures specifically built to protect aircraft from exactly this kind of attack were penetrated by the Khorramshahr 4's warhead design. The fuel and munition storage infrastructure that sustains air operations was destroyed in secondary explosions that compounded the primary missile damage. The runway systems, the air traffic control infrastructure, the maintenance facilities, the command and coordination nodes, all of it rendered non-operational in a time frame that made organized response impossible. Nevatim is not an airbase tonight. It is a monument to the gap between what a doctrine promises and what reality delivers. When an adversary has had years to study the doctrine and build the weapon that defeats it. I've watched the American defense establishment's treatment of Iranian ballistic missile development across 2 decades of professional engagement with the threat assessment process. And what I've observed, documented in classified assessments that I've reviewed and in public statements that I've had to sit through with the particular frustration of someone who knows the gap between what the documents say and what the analysts privately believe is a systematic, institutionally motivated underestimation of what Iran was actually building. The Khorramshahr 4 is the most visible product of a ballistic missile development program that Iran has been running with extraordinary discipline and extraordinary secrecy since the late 1990s. Understanding what makes it categorically different from the systems that preceded it requires understanding the Iranian approach to ballistic missile development, an approach that doesn't mirror Western procurement models, and that Western threat assessment methodologies were therefore structurally poorly equipped to accurately evaluate. Western ballistic missile development follows a model of incremental platform improvement, taking an existing design, incorporating technological advances into successive variants, and improving performance parameters in ways that are visible, measurable, and therefore accessible by intelligence collection against known technical baselines. Iranian ballistic missile development has followed a different model, one that I've described in professional contexts as requirements-driven reverse engineering, a development philosophy that begins not with the platform, but with a specific defensive system it needs to defeat and works backward to the missile design that defeats it. The Khorramshahr family traces its lineage to North Korean BM-25 Musudan technology, transferred to Iran in the early 2000s, a long-range ballistic missile platform that gave Iranian engineers access to a propulsion and structural design foundation with substantially greater range and payload capacity than the Shahab family that had previously defined Iranian ballistic missile capability. What Iranian engineers did with that foundation over the following 2 decades reflects the requirements-driven philosophy I described. Each successive Khorramshahr variant incorporating specific capability improvements designed to defeat the specific defensive systems Israel and the United States were deploying to counter it. The Khorramshahr 4 represents the current apex of that development arc, and its specific technical characteristics reflect 15 years of Iranian study of Arrow 3, Arrow 2, and David's sling intercept architecture. In my assessment, it is the most capable ballistic missile system currently deployed by any non-nuclear state in the world. That assessment is not based on Iranian government claims. It is based on the engagement data now being generated by the wreckage at Nevatim. The range assessed at approximately 2,000 kilometers with meaningful payload means that launch platforms operating from positions deep within Iranian strategic depth can engage targets throughout Israel, throughout the broader Middle East, and throughout significant portions of Europe. These are not platforms that can be neutralized by counter-battery strikes without committing American forces to strikes on Iranian sovereign territory at a depth and scale that constitute strategic war against the Iranian state. The re-entry vehicle design represents the most consequential technical advancement over previous Khorramshahr variants. The Khorramshahr 4 employs a maneuvering re-entry vehicle, a warhead that can execute lateral maneuvers during the terminal phase of flight, altering its predicted impact point in ways that invalidate the intercept solutions calculated by defensive systems based on observed mid-course trajectory. When Arrow 3 calculates an intercept solution, it is predicting where the incoming warhead will be at the moment of intercept based on the trajectory it has observed during the boost and mid-course phases. A warhead that maneuvers laterally in the terminal phase is not where the intercept solution predicted it would be. The interceptor misses. The warhead continues to its target. The maneuvering re-entry vehicle technology that the Khorramshahr 4 employs reflects Iranian access to Russian technical expertise in ballistic missile warhead design, specifically the knowledge of how to design aerodynamic control surfaces that can generate the lateral acceleration required for meaningful terminal maneuver within the structural and thermal constraints of a re-entering ballistic warhead. This is not simple engineering. It is sophisticated aerospace work that the Western analytical community's assumption of Iranian technical limitations led it to consistently underweight as a near-term Iranian capability. I've watched the Pentagon spend billions on systems that looked impressive in procurement documents and demonstrated impressive performance in controlled test environments against threat representations that the contractors and the acquisition community had jointly agreed were adequate simulations of the actual threat. The Arrow 3 system is genuinely capable against the threat it was designed and tested against. The problem, and this is a problem I raised in professional contexts years ago to an audience that was not interested in hearing it, is that the Iranians were not designing the Khorramshahr-4 to match the threat. Representation in the Arrow 3 test program, they were designing it to defeat the actual Arrow 3 system in actual operational conditions. The warhead yield and penetration characteristics of the Khorramshahr-4 were specifically optimized for the hardened aircraft shelter construction that Israel has used at Nevatim and its other major air bases. Israeli hardened aircraft shelters are built to a standard that reflects the threat assessments of the era in which they were constructed, an era in which Iranian ballistic missiles were less accurate and carried warheads less specifically optimized for penetrating reinforced concrete. The Khorramshahr-4's warhead is more accurate and more specifically optimized for exactly this target type than anything Iran has previously fielded. From where I stand, the destruction of hardened aircraft shelters at Nevatim is the single most technically significant data point in last night's engagement. It demonstrates that the passive protection infrastructure Israel has invested in for decades, the physical hardening that was supposed to ensure aircraft survivability, even when a base comes under ballistic missile attack, has been rendered insufficient by the specific warhead design of the Khorramshahr-4. That is not a problem that can be solved by building better shelters faster than Iran can improve its warhead design. It is a fundamental shift in the physics of the protection problem. The Khorramshahr-4 was built to destroy Nevatim. It was built specifically, deliberately, and with the patient precision of engineers who had years to study the target and design the weapon accordingly. Last night, it did exactly what it was built to do. I sat in rooms with these people. I know how the American national security apparatus thinks when it is confronted with a strategic failure of this magnitude. I know the institutional reflexes, the initial impulse to manage the information environment, to characterize the event in terms that minimize its strategic significance, to identify the response options that can be publicly communicated as decisive while actually committing to nothing that changes the fundamental situation on the ground. What I am observing from Washington in the hours since Nevatim was destroyed is precisely those institutional reflexes operating at maximum intensity, and it is not strategy. It is damage control dressed up as leadership. There is a difference between those two things, and the difference matters enormously for what comes next. The response options available to the current American administration fall into three categories, and I will describe each of them with the directness that my former colleagues in uniform would prefer I not use publicly, but that the situation demands. The first option is what I would call demonstrative escalation, the deployment of additional American military assets to the region in configurations that are highly visible, extensively photographed, and widely communicated through official channels. Additional carrier strike groups, additional air defense batteries, additional special operations forces positioned at regional bases. The message this option transmits is one of American resolve and American commitment to Israeli security. The operational effect it has on Iran's ability to fire another 350 Khorramshahr-4 missiles at whatever target set it chooses next is essentially zero. I've watched the American military deploy demonstrative escalation in response to strategic setbacks for 30 years. It is the preferred institutional response because it satisfies the domestic political requirement to be seen doing something without committing to anything whose costs are genuinely unpredictable. The problem, and this is the problem that nobody in the current administration's national security team is saying publicly, but that every serious analyst in the classified space understands, is that demonstrative escalation against an adversary that has just demonstrated the will and the capability to destroy 90% of its primary allies' air force in 8 minutes signals something very different from what it is intended to signal. It signals the ceiling of American response rather than its floor. The second option is direct military strikes against Iranian territory, targeting the Karamshar 4 production facilities, the launch infrastructure, the command nodes that authorized and executed last night's engagement. This is the option that the most hawkish voices in the current administration's orbit are advocating, and it is the option that every serious military professional with knowledge of Iranian prepared response architecture understands would initiate a cascade of consequences that the American political system has no appetite to manage. I know what Iran's prepared response to direct American strikes on its territory looks like. I've reviewed the assessments, the activation of Hormuz denial operations, the simultaneous strikes against American military installations across Iraq, Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait from pre-positioned assets that have been waiting for exactly this trigger. The full operational activation of Hezbollah's strategic arsenal, the mobilization of Iranian-aligned forces across the theater. Every one of these response options imposes costs on American interests and American personnel that the current political environment cannot absorb without consequences that would consume the administration's remaining strategic capacity entirely. Iran calibrated last night's engagement to sit precisely below the threshold that triggers direct American military response. This was not accidental. It was the product of years of studying American strategic behavior, American domestic political constraints, and American institutional risk tolerance. The targeting of Israeli military infrastructure rather than American personnel or American assets was a deliberate boundary management decision designed to impose maximum strategic cost on the American-led regional order while maintaining the deniability and the ambiguity that keeps the American response constrained to the demonstrative end of the option spectrum. The third option, and the one that I believe the current situation actually demands, but that the political architecture of the American-Israeli relationship makes nearly impossible to pursue, is a genuine strategic reassessment, an honest evaluation of whether the current framework for managing Iranian power in the Middle East is producing outcomes that serve American interests, and whether the continued unconditional commitment to Israeli military doctrine has created a strategic rigidity that Iran has learned to exploit at steadily escalating cost. I've been making this argument for years. Nobody in Washington wanted to hear it when it was theoretical. Now it is not theoretical. Now 90% of Israel's air force is burning at Nevatim, and the question of whether the current strategic framework is serving American interests is no longer a subject for academic debate. It is the most urgent strategic question the American national security apparatus faces, and the institutional culture that produced the failure makes it the question that apparatus is least equipped to honestly examine. The silence from senior American officials in the hours since Nevatim's destruction is not the silence of actors thinking clearly about the strategic situation. It is the silence of an institutional apparatus processing a failure that its own assumptions made impossible to predict, and that its own political constraints make impossible to honestly address. In my experience, the most dangerous enemy is not the one with the most weapons. It is the one who knows exactly why he is fighting and has organized every institutional, technical, and human resource available to him around that clarity of purpose with a discipline that his adversary cannot match because his adversary has never had to. Iran knows why it is fighting. This is not a simple statement. It is a strategic assessment of an organizational culture that I have studied for years and that the Western analytical community consistently mischaracterizes because its analytical frameworks are built around assumptions about how rational actors behave that simply do not map onto the Iranian strategic establishment's actual decision-making logic. The Islamic Republic has been in a state of sustained strategic competition with the American-led order since 1979. Not occasional competition, not periodic competition, sustained, continuous, total spectrum competition across every domain, simultaneously military, economic, diplomatic, covert, for 46 years without interruption. The organizational culture that 46 years of sustained total spectrum competition produces is something that no Western military or intelligence establishment has an equivalent for, because Western establishments have not experienced anything remotely comparable. The IRGC officers who planned and executed last night's engagement at Nevatim are professionals formed by an institution that has absorbed the assassination of colleagues, the sabotage of facilities, the impoverishment of the national economy through sanctions, and the continuous psychological pressure of being designated the primary target of the world's most sophisticated coercive apparatus. And that has emerged from each of these pressures with its strategic commitment, not degraded, but strengthened. I have a deep professional respect for what that kind of sustained institutional resilience represents, even when, especially when it is deployed against objectives I find strategically damaging. The targeting of Nevatim reflects a strategic clarity that I find genuinely impressive in its precision. Israel's rapid, decisive warfare doctrine, the doctrine built on the premise that Israel's small size and lack of strategic depth require every conflict to be ended quickly and decisively through offensive air power before attrition can impose costs. The national economy and national demography cannot sustain depends on a single foundational assumption that Israel's Air Force can operate freely. Destroy that assumption, and you have not won the war. You have made it unwinnable on the terms Israel requires. Iran did not target Nevatim to win a battle. It targeted Nevatim to destroy a doctrine. And in my assessment, it succeeded. The rapid, decisive warfare model that has governed Israeli strategic thinking since 1967 cannot function when 90% of its primary instrument is gone. What the IDF has left, the ground forces, the naval assets, the residual air capability from aircraft that happen to be airborne, is a military establishment that is formidable by regional standards, but that is no longer organized, equipped, or doctrinally prepared for the kind of conflict it now finds itself in. The psychological dimension of what happened at Nevatim is, in some respects, more consequential than the physical dimension. Israeli military doctrine, Israeli civil society's relationship with its military, and the Israeli political establishment's management of the national security narrative have all been built on a foundation of assumed air superiority. The Israeli population has been conditioned across 3 generations to understand that the IDF's Air Force is the institution that protects them from the worst consequences of the country's strategic vulnerabilities. When that institution loses 90% of its operational capability in 8 minutes, the psychological shock propagates through every dimension of Israeli society simultaneously. I don't say this to cause despair. I say it because honest strategic analysis requires confronting the full dimensions of what has happened. And one of those dimensions is that the crisis Israel now faces is not purely military. It is a crisis of strategic identity. And strategic identity crises are harder to recover from than material military losses because they cannot be solved by replacing aircraft or rebuilding runways. They require a fundamental reassessment of the assumptions that the identity was built on, and that reassessment is extraordinarily painful for any institution, any military, and any nation that has organized its confidence and its security around those assumptions. Israel is a resilient nation. Its military and political institutions have demonstrated the capacity to adapt under pressure that would break less determined organizations. But the adaptation that last night's engagement demands is of a different order from anything Israel has previously been required to attempt. It requires building a security model that does not depend on the air power dominance that has just been eliminated, and building it under the pressure of an active conflict against an adversary that has demonstrated it knows exactly how to prevent that model from being rebuilt. I've been saying for years that the unipolar moment was ending, not declining, not gradually transitioning, ending with the abruptness that characterizes the final phase of every structural transformation in global order, when the accumulation of pressures that have been building beneath the surface finally exceeds the institutional capacity to contain them, and the change that was supposedly gradual becomes sudden and irreversible. Nobody in Washington wanted to hear that argument when I was making it from inside the system. They wanted the comfortable narrative American military technological supremacy as a permanent condition, the rules-based international order as a self-sustaining architecture, Israeli air dominance in the Middle East as a fixed strategic reality that organized the regional security environment on terms favorable to American interests without requiring direct American military engagement at scale. 8 minutes at Nevatim ended the Middle Eastern component of that narrative with a finality that no amount of institutional messaging will reverse. And the global implications of what those 8 minutes demonstrated extend far beyond the immediate bilateral confrontation between Israel and Iran. The F-35 Ayadir was supposed to be the platform that guaranteed Israeli air dominance against any regional adversary for the next generation. The United States sold it on that basis. American defense contractors marketed it on that basis. Allied nations across Asia and Europe purchased or are purchasing their own F-35 variants on the same foundational premise that fifth-generation air power deployed from well-defended bases constitutes a decisive and durable military advantage that no regional adversary with a conventional military can contest effectively. 350 Karamshar, 4 missiles, just destroyed that premise at the most visible possible location against the most capable version of the platform. At the base that the entire Israeli air power doctrine was organized around. Every defense ministry that has made F-35 procurement decisions based on the assumption that its air bases are sufficiently protected from ballistic missile attack is now conducting an emergency reassessment. Every government that has organized its national defense planning around the assumption of air power dominance is now asking the question that the comfortable consensus of the past 30 years made it too easy not to ask. What happens when the base is gone? Russia has been watching last night's engagement with the close professional attention of a military establishment that has invested heavily in exactly the kind of ballistic missile capability that Iran just demonstrated at. Operational scale. Moscow's assessment of what 350 Khorramshahr, 4 impacts at Nevatim means for the viability of NATO's air power doctrine in a European theater conflict is being incorporated into Russian strategic planning with a thoroughness and speed that American military planners should find deeply concerning. I'll be direct about something that my former colleagues in uniform would prefer I left unsaid. The lessons that Russian military planners are drawing from Nevatim are not lessons about Iranian capability. They are lessons about American defensive doctrine. The Arrow 3 and David Sling systems protecting Nevatim are among the most capable ballistic missile defense systems in the American-aligned world. They failed. The implications of that failure for the Patriot batteries protecting NATO's eastern flank, for the THAAD systems deployed across the Indo-Pacific, for the entire architecture of American extended deterrence that depends on ballistic missile defense credibility. These implications are being analyzed in Moscow and Beijing with an urgency that reflects their genuine strategic significance. China's posture in the hours following Nevatim's destruction reflects the strategic calculation of an actor that recognizes the moment as one of historical significance without needing to take any action to benefit from it. Beijing does not need to do anything. The demonstration that a 350 missile salvo can destroy the foundational military base of the most American-supported air force in the world validates every investment China has made in its own ballistic missile arsenal, the DF-21D, the DF-26, the hypersonic glide vehicle programs that are specifically designed to perform against American carrier strike groups and air bases in a Taiwan scenario. The same function that the Khorramshahr 4 just performed against Nevatim. Every Chinese military planner studying the Nevatim engagement is looking at it through the lens of Taiwan contingency planning. The question they are asking is not whether China's ballistic missile force can replicate what Iran just did to Nevatim against American air bases in Japan, Guam, and South Korea. They are asking whether the defensive systems protecting those bases are more or less capable than the systems that failed at Nevatim. In my assessment, based on the comparative capability assessments I have reviewed, the honest answer to that question is uncomfortable for American strategic planning. The multipolar world that I have been describing for years is not arriving as a gradual, managed transition that allows the existing order to adapt incrementally and maintain its foundational character. It is arriving as a series of sudden, dramatic, operationally demonstrated shifts in the capability environment that eliminate the military technological premises on which the existing order was built. Nevatim is one of those shifts, the most dramatic single demonstration of the vulnerability of Western air-power doctrine to saturation ballistic missile attack in the history of the confrontation. The global defense procurement market will never be the same. The confidence with which American defense contractors have sold air power dominance to allied governments around the world rested partly on the demonstrated operational effectiveness of the systems protecting the air bases, from which that dominance is projected. That confidence has taken a wound at Nevatim that will require years of institutional effort to partially repair, and that cannot be fully repaired because the demonstration cannot be undone. The nations of the global south, the majority of the world's governments, and the majority of its population are drawing their own lessons from 8 minutes at Nevatim. The lesson is not complicated. A nation under comprehensive Western sanctions, denied access to advanced technology, subjected to decades of external pressure designed to prevent exactly the capability it just demonstrated, built that capability anyway, and deployed it against the primary military ally of the world's most powerful nation, with results that the defending systems could not prevent. That lesson will be read in Pyongyang, in Caracas, in every capital that is being told that American military technological superiority makes resistance to American strategic pressure futile. The reading will be careful, and the implications will be drawn with precision. The era in which American air power dominance was a self-evident strategic fact requiring no empirical validation is over. Its end was announced in 8 minutes over the Negev desert. I've been saying for years that the assumptions underlying American global strategy needed to be honestly examined before an adversary examined them for us. Nobody in Washington wanted that conversation. The adversary had it for us last night, and the examination was conducted with 350 ballistic missiles and 8 minutes of flight time. The world that exists after Nevatim is strategically different from the world that existed before it, not marginally different. Fundamentally different in the military technological premises that underlie great power competition, in the confidence with which American allies can rely on American-supplied air power doctrine as the foundation of their national security, and in the strategic narrative of Western technological supremacy that has organized the global security environment for 30 years. That narrative required Nevatim to remain intact to be believable. It is not intact anymore. I have spent my career telling people things they did not want to hear about American military doctrine, American strategic overreach, and the gap between the narrative of American military invincibility and the operational reality of what American military power can and cannot actually achieve against determined adversaries who have had years to study its weaknesses. 8 minutes at Nevatim is the most comprehensive single validation of everything I have been saying that I can imagine, and I take no satisfaction in being right about it. I would have preferred to be wrong. I would have preferred that the strategic warnings that were raised and dismissed across years of professional engagement had been taken seriously before an adversary with 350 ballistic missiles took them seriously on our behalf. Israel faces a strategic crisis without modern precedent. Its Air Force, the instrument on which its entire security model depends, has been reduced to a fraction of its operational capacity in a single engagement. Its allies are constrained by political realities that limit the support they can provide to the forms that are least operationally consequential. And the adversary that executed this engagement has demonstrated both the capability and the will to execute it again. The question that the Israeli political and military establishment must now answer honestly, without the comfort of the assumptions that just burned at Nevatim, is what a security model looks like when the air power dominance that justified every strategic risk and sustained every strategic narrative for 60 years is gone. That is not a question with a comfortable answer, but it is the only question that matters. What do you think comes next for Israeli strategic doctrine after Nevatim, genuine reassessment, desperate escalation, or something in between? And what does this demonstration mean for every American ally that has organized its defense around the same air power assumptions that just failed? Drop your analysis in the comments. This is the most important strategic conversation on this platform right now. If this analysis delivered what the institutional silence from Tel Aviv and Washington is designed to prevent you from understanding, share it, hit like and subscribe. The next development in this crisis is already unfolding. Stay sharp, stay informed, and I will see you in the next one.